We give them the security and the safety that they need. And we're a very open family, so we talk about, things that bother us and things that trouble us.
Just minutes ago, the royal family shattered their silence with an announcement no one saw coming. Prince William and Princess Catherine broke every protocol to deliver news so devastating it stopped the nation cold. This wasn't about titles or tradition. This was about their child, Prince Louis. What they just confirmed has left millions in shock, and what they're still hiding might be even worse. The carefully protected image you thought you knew just crumbled completely.
The love we feel in our earliest years fundamentally shapes who we become and how we thrive as adults.
What happened behind palace walls will break your heart. The message appeared without warning. There was no advance notice to the press, no prepared briefing for royal correspondence, no carefully staged photo opportunity. Instead, a single statement materialized across the official royal social media platforms and website. The post was brief, fewer than 100 words, but every sentence carried an unmistakable weight. Royal watchers immediately recognized the significance of the timing. When announcements come at unusual hours outside the normal schedule of palace communications, it typically means something serious has happened behind the scenes. What truly caught everyone off guard wasn't just the content itself, it was who was speaking. For the first time in recent memory, the palace allowed the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge to issue the statement directly. Not through a press secretary, not through an official spokesperson, not filtered through layers of palace staff. William and Catherine spoke as parents first, breaking through decades of royal tradition that keeps the family insulated from direct public communication during personal crises. The tone of their words was measured but unmistakably heavy. There was no attempt to sugarcoat the situation, but also no explicit details that would satisfy the public's immediate questions. Instead, phrases like deeply personal matter, grateful for your understanding, and ongoing support appeared throughout the text. Anyone familiar with the coded language the monarchy uses understood immediately that these weren't just polite requests for privacy. They were indications that something far more serious was unfolding within the Wales household. Within minutes of the statement going live, news organisations scrambled to respond. Broadcast schedules were interrupted. Royal correspondents, many of whom had covered the family for decades, appeared genuinely shaken as they tried to analyse what little information had been provided. Some admitted on air that they had never witnessed anything quite like this approach from the palace. The usual polish and careful management that characterises royal announcements was absent, replaced by something that felt raw and urgent. Social media erupted almost instantly. Twitter threads dissected every word of the statement. Royal watching communities on various platforms began comparing notes, trying to piece together what might have led to this moment. The news spread rapidly beyond the United Kingdom, reaching audiences in Europe, Australia, Canada, and the United States within the hour. This wasn't being treated as just another royal story. People sensed they were witnessing something that cut deeper than typical palace news. Veteran royal commentators began drawing parallels to other moments in recent royal history when the carefully maintained image of the family had cracked. Some recalled the announcement of Princess Diana's death in 1997, remembering the stunned silence that followed, the sense that time itself had stopped. Others thought about the more recent passing of Queen Elizabeth, when the nation collectively held its breath. But this felt different in a fundamental way. Those previous moments, as tragic as they were, involved the end of long lives or expected transitions. This was about a young child, a boy whose face had brought smiles to millions during public appearances, now at the center of a statement that radiated concern and sadness. The language used in the statement was particularly telling to those trained in reading between the lines of royal communications. These weren't the words typically reserved for minor health issues or temporary setbacks. Phrases that might normally appear in palace statements during difficult times were conspicuously absent. There were no reassurances about expected recovery timelines, no mention of doctors being optimistic, no suggestion that normal activities would resume shortly. The absence of these standard comforting elements spoke louder than what was actually written. Britain's reaction was immediate and emotional. The nation that had watched Prince Louis grow from a newborn into a spirited young boy suddenly found itself confronting the possibility that something was seriously wrong. People didn't need all the details to understand the gravity of the situation. The tone, the timing, and the direct involvement of William and Catherine painted a clear enough picture. This was a family in crisis, and despite all their privilege and resources, they were facing something that couldn't be managed away with protocol and procedure. As the initial shock began to settle, a different kind of concern emerged. People started asking questions not just about what had happened, but about what wasn't being said. Royal statements are carefully crafted documents, usually designed to inform while simultaneously calming public anxiety. This statement had done the opposite. It had informed just enough to confirm something was wrong, but had left gaps that created more anxiety rather than less. Every carefully chosen word seemed to carry the weight of information being deliberately withheld. Analysts and commentators noticed the pauses in the phrasing, the soft diplomatic language that seemed to dance around harder truths. This wasn't the vocabulary of optimism or even cautious hope. It read more like preparation, as if William and Catherine were trying to ready the public for news they weren't quite prepared to deliver fully. Within hours, experienced royal observers were voicing the question that everyone was thinking, but few wanted to ask out loud. What exactly were the Prince and Princess of Wales not ready to tell the world? The statement had achieved something unusual in modern royal communications. Rather than providing closure or clarity, it had opened a space filled with uncertainty and concern. The British public, along with royal watchers globally, found themselves in an uncomfortable position of knowing something was deeply wrong while having almost no concrete information about what that something actually was. And perhaps most unsettling of all was the realization that if William and Catherine felt compelled to break with tradition and speak directly, the situation must be far more serious than anyone had initially imagined. The carefully maintained distance between the royal family and public emotion had collapsed in a single statement, leaving everyone to wonder what would come next. In the hours following the initial statement, newsrooms didn't simply report what had been said. They began dissecting how it had been said, analysing the tone and structure with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for political speeches or legal documents. The language was muted, almost mournful, and that quality proved more revealing than any specific detail. What stood out most prominently was the complete absence of reassuring phrases that typically appear in palace communications during difficult times. There were no timelines offered, no suggestions of when things might return to normal, no comforting words about expected full recoveries or positive responses to treatment. The message existed in a strange suspended state, calm on the surface but deeply unsettling underneath. According to sources close to the palace, staff members had spent hours working on the statement, pausing between sentences, fully aware that each word would be analysed and interpreted by millions. They weren't simply drafting a press release, they were attempting to prepare the public for something that couldn't be easily reversed or fixed. The careful avoidance of medical terminology was particularly noticeable. There were no mentions of doctors, no references to specific health issues, no clinical language whatsoever. This deliberate omission told its own story. The statement read less like an explanation and more like a surrender to circumstances beyond anyone's control. What wasn't said became just as important as what was. There was no mention of when Prince Louis might return to public appearances, no hint about going back to school, no reference to future events where he might be seen alongside his brother and sister. The complete absence of any forward-looking projection made it clear this wasn't a temporary pause. Something fundamental had shifted. Behind closed doors, whispers began circulating that this crisis had been building for much longer than the public realized. Journalists who had covered the royal family for years started reviewing recent footage and photographs of Prince Louis. Moments that had seemed perfectly normal at the time were now being re-examined with fresh perspective. Smiles that once appeared genuine now looked strained. Instances dismissed as typical childhood behavior were being reinterpreted as potential warning signs. Even the body language in family photos took on new meaning, with observers noting subtle details in how William, Catherine, and Louis interacted during public appearances. The signs had been there, people now realized. They had simply gone unnoticed or been explained away as nothing concerning. The public wasn't alone in being caught unprepared. Reports suggested that some palace staff only learned the full extent of the situation hours before the statement was released. Their shock and grief was genuine, not performed for cameras or public sympathy. This wasn't just about a child facing difficulties. It represented the collapse of a carefully maintained belief that the youngest royals, protected by security and routine, were somehow shielded from the kinds of struggles that affect ordinary families. Perhaps most devastating was the growing understanding that this situation wasn't temporary. This wasn't a brief interruption to royal life that would soon be resolved. It was the quiet beginning of something more permanent, though exactly what that meant remained unclear. The statement hadn't announced a loss, but it felt like preparation for one. The protective facade that surrounds the royal family had developed cracks, and behind it stood two parents struggling to contain a pain they could no longer hide. Then Prince William did something that broke centuries of royal instinct. He stepped forward and spoke not as a future king, but as a father who was coming apart. There was no prepared script, no formal podium, no protective layer of official protocol. His voice wavered, his composure cracked, and in that moment, one of the monarchy's most carefully guarded illusions shattered completely. The world was witnessing raw grief, fear, and helplessness from someone trained since birth to never show such vulnerability. The moment William began speaking, it became immediately obvious that something fundamental had changed. This wasn't a formal address. It felt more like a confession. The carefully maintained image of the steady, composed heir disappeared, replaced by a man barely holding back emotions that had been building beneath the surface for months. He didn't open with traditional pleasantries or thank anyone for their time and attention. Instead, he began with 6 words that brought an entire nation to a standstill. I should have seen it sooner. In that single sentence, William dismantled decades of royal distance and formality. He wasn't speaking with authority or power. He was speaking as someone who felt he had failed. He described months of quiet tension within the household, explaining how Louis had gradually become quieter and more withdrawn. The family had initially dismissed these changes as a normal phase of development. Palace life, with all its rituals and obligations, had somehow masked what was truly happening at home. The warning signs had become easier to overlook as time passed, not harder to miss. Beneath his candid words lay a deeper truth about the guilt William was carrying. He spoke about nights spent walking the palace corridors, wondering how he could be so attuned to matters of state and national affairs while remaining blind to the pain within his own home. He recalled specific moments when Louis would ask to skip family engagements, times when his laughter sounded rehearsed rather than spontaneous, instances when his eyes, once so full of curiosity and wonder, appeared hollow and distant. And still, William admitted, he had done nothing because accepting the truth felt impossible. One particular memory broke through William's composure entirely. He paused, visibly struggling to maintain control, and then shared something Louis had once asked him. The question was simple but devastating in its implications. Do I have to smile when I don't feel it? Those words cut deeper than any scandal or controversy ever could. This wasn't rebellion or misbehavior, it was a plea from a child drowning under the weight of expectations he didn't understand and couldn't meet. That moment, William confessed, was when he finally saw his son clearly, and the realization nearly destroyed him. William held nothing back. He revealed how the emotional crisis had affected every aspect of their lives. His marriage had been strained. His relationship with his children had shifted. The dynamic between George, Charlotte, and Louis had fundamentally changed. The balance that had existed in their household had tilted dramatically. Catherine was trying desperately to hold everything together. George had grown noticeably more serious and withdrawn. And Charlotte had begun watching Louis with the kind of quiet worry that mirrored their mother's constant concern. Perhaps the most painful admission came when William acknowledged that their attempts to protect Louis had actually isolated him further. He said it plainly and without attempting to soften the truth. In their effort to shield him from outside pressures and public scrutiny, they had built walls so high that even they couldn't see through them anymore. The protective measures meant to help had instead created distance and separation. For the first time, the world was seeing what happened when royal duty collided directly with parental instinct, and how the resulting damage often remained invisible until it was almost too late to address. But while William was speaking publicly about his own failures and fears, another child in the family was quietly breaking behind closed doors. Princess Charlotte had never been meant to carry any of this weight. Yet as Prince Tance, Louis retreated further into himself. It was his sister who stepped into the emotional void he left behind. She began absorbing fears she couldn't fully understand and trying to protect him from pain she had no ability to fix. When her own strength finally gave way, Catherine realized something truly devastating. The tragedy affecting their family wasn't contained to one child. It was spreading silently through all of them, touching each person in ways that were only now becoming visible. In the early days of Louis's struggle, Charlotte remained remarkably steady. She was the one who held his hand during public events when cameras were pointed their way. She was the one who leaned in close and whispered to him when attention shifted elsewhere. She positioned herself slightly closer to him than necessary during family appearances. Many observers had noted this behavior and assumed it was simply a close sibling bond, the natural protectiveness of an older sister. But it was far more than that. Charlotte, despite her young age, had begun carrying a burden no child should ever bear. She had become her brother's translator, his shadow, and without anyone fully realizing it, his shield against a world that felt increasingly overwhelming. It wasn't until weeks after William's public confession that the signs of Charlotte's internal collapse finally became visible. Catherine later recounted a moment that shattered her heart. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon at home when Charlotte suddenly refused to speak. This wasn't defiance or anger, it was complete emotional exhaustion. She curled into herself, her eyes wide but distant, staring at nothing in particular. When Catherine asked what was wrong, Charlotte responded with a whisper that no parent ever forgets. "I didn't want you to worry more." That single sentence pierced deeper than any headline or public criticism ever could. It confirmed what Catherine had feared, but hoped wasn't true. The children weren't simply being affected by the crisis surrounding Louis, they were actively managing it. In their attempts to protect their parents from additional pain, they had become casualties of that very pain themselves. The roles had reversed in the most heartbreaking way possible. The children were now shielding the adults. By this point, Louis had almost completely withdrawn from normal routines. He no longer asked about his school friends or expressed interest in seeing them. He stopped begging to stay up late for special occasions. He no longer laughed at the silly jokes that only children find funny. The spark that had once defined his personality was fading slowly and painfully. Catherine watched as Charlotte tried every single day to bring that spark back, using games, songs, and simple companionship, but nothing was working. And gradually, Charlotte herself began slipping into the same quiet despair. Inside the palace walls, where duty typically overrides emotion, no one had fully grasped what this silence was doing to the family. There were no dramatic arguments, no visible chaos, just a slow suffocation of feeling. Charlotte's collapse became the loudest warning they had received, and it came not through tantrums or tears, but through complete stillness. That was the moment Catherine understood with absolute clarity. They hadn't just missed Louis's pain, they had failed to see how it was echoing through every corner of their home, affecting each person in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. The realization shattered any remaining illusion that the crisis could be managed or contained within acceptable boundaries. It had spread like a quiet tide, pulling at the bonds between siblings, straining the relationship between parents, and undermining the entire structure of their carefully planned royal routine. The silence they had maintained, believing it would protect the family, had actually been their greatest enemy all along. It was no longer something they could sustain. Then came the moment that confirmed the crisis had reached an irreversible breaking point. Prince Louis vanished from daily life entirely. It should have been an ordinary morning, but Louis never arrived at school. There were no scheduled appearances, no explanations were offered. Behind the scenes, a decision had been made so drastic that it would permanently alter the course of his childhood. The monarchy had quietly removed its youngest member from public life, and the reasons were far more serious than anyone outside the family realized. The silence surrounding his absence was deafening. For a child whose occasional waves and playful expressions had captivated millions of people, the sudden disappearance was not only noticed, but deeply felt. Parents at his school received brief, carefully worded communications. His classmates were told he would be learning from home for the foreseeable future. The media, unusually restrained in their coverage, respected the communication blackout, though not without obvious suspicion. Something had fundamentally shifted, and whatever had happened had shaken the House of Wales to its very core. Insiders would later speak carefully about a specific incident at school that reportedly became the final catalyst. While details remain deliberately vague out of respect for Louis's privacy, sources hint at a triggering interaction that left him emotionally overwhelmed and unable to re-engage with his normal environment. It wasn't a physical altercation, it wasn't a disciplinary matter, it was purely emotional. Something inside him cracked in that moment, and Catherine knew immediately that the outside world was no longer safe for her son. Not emotionally, not mentally, not in any way that mattered. Within hours of that incident, the family retreated from public life. A series of emergency meetings followed in rapid succession. William and Catherine, who had been so devoted to the principle of raising their children with as much normality as possible, now faced the harsh reality that traditional approaches could no longer protect their child. The pressure to be seen, to wave at crowds, to smile on command, to behave like a perfectly polished royal child had become toxic. It had to stop immediately. The decision they made was unprecedented in modern royal history. They chose to fully remove a young prince from public view without any of the usual explanations. There was no illness to cite, no scandal to manage, no relocation to announce, no tour abroad, no extended summer at Balmoral, no gentle public explanation. Just absence. William and Catherine made the deliberate choice not to announce it formally. There would be no public farewell, no carefully staged photographs to mark his temporary withdrawal from royal duties. Instead, they embraced something the royal family rarely allows itself: silence as a form of protection. Behind the scenes, however, the emotional weight of this choice was crushing for both parents. Louis didn't fight the decision. He didn't resist or ask questions. But he also didn't ask why, and that passive acceptance broke Catherine's heart. His resignation was quiet, almost mechanical. The child who had once lit up every room he entered had become someone careful, guarded, almost detached from his surroundings. Mental health experts quietly brought in to assess the situation warned of potential long-term impacts, especially if royal expectations continued to linger even in private, after the public gaze had been removed. What haunted William and Catherine most wasn't simply that they had failed to recognize the warning signs earlier. It was the terrifying possibility that every effort they had made to raise their children in a balanced, relatively normal environment had somehow backfired. Even their version of normal was still fundamentally rooted in protocol, legacy, and public duty. Now they were left wondering whether the very identity Louis had been born into was the thing that was tearing him apart from the inside. As the family retreated inward and tried to find their footing, an unexpected figure stepped forward with decisive action. Someone who understood the cost of royal pressure better than almost anyone else. When advisors hesitated and palace systems stalled in bureaucratic procedure, Princess Anne acted without waiting for permission or consensus. She recognized the patterns immediately: the pressure, the silence, the accumulating damage. And she refused to let history repeat itself. What she offered Prince Louis wasn't treatment wrapped in royal protocol or managed through official channels. It was something far more radical within the context of the monarchy. She offered him simplicity and genuine normality. The palace had slipped into a state of near paralysis. Bureaucrats debated the optics of every possible move. Advisors tiptoed around language, worried about setting precedents or sending the wrong signals. Communication strategists focused on how each decision might be perceived by the public and the press. But amid all this careful deliberation, no one was asking the only question that actually mattered. What would genuinely help the child at the center of this crisis? While others scrambled to develop damage control strategies, Princess Anne, who had long served as the pragmatic anchor of the family, picked up the phone and demanded to speak with William. She wasn't calling as a member of the royal family or as someone offering counsel from a distance. She was calling as a sister who had witnessed too much of the monarchy's emotional cost over the decades and had accumulated too many regrets about moments when she might have intervened, but didn't. What followed was a conversation that shattered protocol into pieces. Anne didn't ask for permission or wait for approval from palace committees. She gave clear direction. She told William that Louis needed to get out of the palaces with their endless corridors and watching eyes, out of the rigid routines that governed every hour of royal life, out of the suffocating expectations that were slowly destroying his spirit. The solution wasn't more media statements or lengthy round-table meetings with advisors. It was something the crown had almost never embraced in modern times: genuine simplicity. Under Anne's watchful supervision, Louis was quietly moved. Not to a hospital or psychiatric facility, not to a therapist's office for scheduled sessions. Instead, he was taken to a space where royal titles meant nothing and where responsibilities were real and tangible. His days began with structure, but not structure designed for appearances or public consumption. It was a structure built around purpose: feeding animals, walking outdoors in all weather, completing simple chores. These weren't punishments or therapeutic exercises disguised as activities. They were grounding experiences that reconnected him to something basic and human. Anne knew exactly what she was doing. She had lived through enough royal history to understand the patterns. She had watched Princess Diana's cries for help get buried under layers of tradition and protocol. She had seen Prince Harry eventually rebel against the system that confined him. She had watched William internalize everything, keeping his struggles hidden. She had witnessed an entire family fracture beneath the crushing weight of maintaining appearances. Years ago, she had decided that if she ever saw this pattern emerging again, she would intervene immediately and decisively. With Louis, she kept that promise to herself. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to shift in Louis. He started speaking more, not in careful, measured responses, but in actual conversation. He ate with more ease, no longer treating meals as obligations to be endured. His eyes, which had been heavy and distant for months, began to focus again on the world around him. There was no magical breakthrough moment, no dramatic turning point that could be captured and celebrated. But there were small, vital signs that something inside him was gradually reawakening. He began asking questions again out of genuine curiosity rather than politeness. He smiled occasionally, and these smiles weren't for cameras or expectations. They were for himself. Anne kept all of this away from public scrutiny. No photographs were taken. No information was leaked to the press. She insisted on complete privacy, even as some palace insiders grew increasingly uncomfortable with how far she was stepping beyond her traditional role. But to Anne, roles and titles had always mattered less than actual responsibility. And in this situation, her responsibility was crystal clear. Protect the child, not the institution's image or reputation. Yet as Louis began the slow process of rebuilding himself far from the institution that had contributed to breaking him, whispers inside the palace walls began to circulate. Not everyone was pleased with Anne's quiet defiance of normal procedures. Her actions, while helping the child, had also exposed fundamental flaws in the system. And institutional systems, especially ones as old and entrenched as the monarchy, don't respond well to being exposed as inadequate or harmful. But as Louis continued his gradual healing process, darker forces within the palace bureaucracy were already moving. Just as genuine hope began to surface for the family, a confidential document detonated inside the monarchy like a bomb. Its language was cold, strategic, and utterly terrifying in its implications. The memo didn't speak about healing or recovery or what was best for a child. It spoke about optics, containment strategies, and risk management. When William finally read it, he understood something truly horrifying. To certain people within the institution, his son had become a problem to be managed efficiently, not a child who deserved protection and care. The memo was never intended to reach William and Catherine. It had been drafted behind closed doors by senior aides, circulated among a small group of advisors, and marked with strict confidentiality warnings. But as often happens within palace walls where loyalty and discretion can be complicated, secrets don't stay buried forever. When the document eventually found its way to William, it wasn't just a breach of trust, it felt like a profound betrayal wrapped in cold administrative formality. The language throughout the memo was clinical and completely devoid of emotion. Prince Louis's name appeared not in any context of care, concern, or compassion. Instead, it appeared under phrases like reputational volatility, visibility exposure, and containment strategy. The document read like a corporate damage control report, not a family's response to tragedy. There was no mention of Louis's emotional state or well-being, no consideration given to what the child had actually endured. Instead, there were bullet points focused on minimizing public questions, redirecting media attention toward more positive narratives, and even subtle suggestions that long-term invisibility might represent the most stabilizing path forward for the institution. It wasn't a plan designed to help Louis heal, it was essentially a blueprint for making him disappear from public consciousness. William's reaction was immediate and explosive. For a man who had been trained since childhood in discipline and careful composure, the fury that followed stunned even his closest aides and staff members. He reportedly stormed out of the room where he'd been reading, a memo clutched in his hand, demanding to know who had authorized such a document. Staff members described hearing raised voices echoing through corridors, with William shouting that his son was not a headline to be managed, and that this family had already buried far too many painful truths behind walls of silence. Catherine's response was equally forceful, but manifested differently. Where William's rage shook the walls and demanded immediate answers, Catherine's anger cut with surgical precision. She walked directly into the offices of the senior advisors responsible and placed the printed memo on the table in front of them. She didn't say anything at first. She simply stared at them with an expression that left absolutely no room for defense or explanation. Then, quietly but with unmistakable firmness, she asked a single, devastating question. Would you speak this way if it were your own child? There was no answer. The silence in that room was absolute. Princess Anne, upon hearing about the memo's existence and content, refused to let the matter slide quietly away. She had been the one steady force holding the family's emotional center together during the worst of the crisis, and now she could see with perfect clarity what she had long suspected. Parts of the institution still valued legacy and tradition above actual human life, and didn't simply express outrage in private conversations. She made phone calls to key figures, demanded accountability from people who rarely faced consequences, and publicly stood by William and Catherine in what many observers described as the most unfiltered display of familial unity the modern monarchy had witnessed in decades. But the damage had already been done. Someone, whether out of conscience or calculation, leaked portions of the memo to the press. When excerpts were published in major newspapers, the public backlash was instantaneous and fierce. Headlines condemned the palace's apparent insensitivity and bureaucratic coldness. Mental health organizations issued strongly worded statements criticizing the approach. Social media platforms exploded with anger, disbelief, and overwhelming support for the Wales family. For the first time in many decades, the royal institution found itself not defending against external scandal or controversy, but against accusations of its own soulless internal machinery. This wasn't simply a public relations disaster that could be managed with careful messaging. It represented a moral collapse that cut to the heart of what the monarchy claimed to represent. The public saw it for exactly what it was, an institution attempting to silence and hide a vulnerable child for the sake of preserving traditional appearances and avoiding uncomfortable questions. What palace advisors failed to anticipate was the tidal wave of public fury that would follow because the veil had finally been lifted. The nation was no longer willing to look the other way or accept reassurances that everything was being handled appropriately behind closed doors. With trust fundamentally shattered and public outrage building to unsustainable levels, the palace was left with no choice but to do something it had avoided for generations. The carefully maintained illusion of royal invulnerability finally broke completely. In a statement unlike anything issued before, the palace made an admission that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. Prince Louis was receiving ongoing emotional recovery support. There were no euphemisms, no diplomatic deflections, no coded language, just direct, honest truth. In a single sentence, centuries of royal tradition around hiding vulnerability collapsed entirely, and the public response was overwhelming in its support and understanding.